katoa e te whanau a ihu kraiti. Ki te mihi ki tō tātou kaihanga, kororia ki te atoa. Ki te mihi ki te mana whenua, ki tēnei rohi nai tahu. Ki te mihi mahana ki a koto. Tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā rā tātou katoa. It was 2014. I was living in Colorado Springs that year. The sun was pouring into the room where I was praying with a mentor friend as we sat in big armchairs. I knew from the burning sensation in me that something significant was happening. That afternoon, I had the most tangibly real experience of God that I have ever had. I felt God in my body, and I heard from God clearly. 2 years later, I was beginning to realize that I was burnt out. I had left staff with the Canadian Navigators after a particularly difficult season. I knew and had experienced God working in and through me. I knew that God is real. I had been able to help students and others in their faith and life. I loved discipling students and training leaders, but I was tired. I kept showing up for my quiet times, but more often I left empty. I had extended myself to leading in areas that were a bad fit because that's what was needed. I felt like I was giving myself to others, but wasn't serving in areas of my giftedness. Over the years, I had endured too many hurts and was so exhausted that I didn't know if I still wanted to follow God. It felt like too much work. I had stopped feeling God in my gut as I used to. My previous fruitful ministry experiences were soured by disillusionment. I simply didn't want to die to myself and follow God anymore. So in 2016, I decided to move to New Zealand on a working holiday. I had a few reasons for moving to the other side of the world, but one of the big ones was that I needed space from the expectations from my 10 years of vocational ministry. Came to New Zealand sure that I was done with university students, done with Christian organizations, and I was pretty sure I was done with God. I was grateful for what God had done in and through me in my previous life, but I didn't want to labor anymore. In the years that followed, though, God made it clear that God was not done with me. When I wanted to walk away, I was reminded of that prayer experience in Colorado. I felt in my body the way that God spoke to me that afternoon. My mind and my spirit wanted to quit, but the physical experience I had kept me tethered to a God I wasn't sure I wanted to still be connected to. I had gotten into hiking when I lived in Colorado, and I started tramping shortly after moving here. I would often wrestle with God as I slogged up a mountain, the difficulty of the steep climb mirroring the frustration and tension I felt inside. It was on my tramps that I experienced a deep communing with God in my spirit that went beyond words. And as I grew attuned to God's presence with me while I wrestled, verses I had long ago memorized came to mind. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." As I gardened, other promises came to mind. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth, making it bud and flourish so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. As I sowed seeds and planted seedlings into the soil, I was reminded of God's promise of faithfulness. This gave me hope. And throughout all of this, many friends walked with me through the dark and difficult years. We talked and they prayed. They listened and grieved with me. They empathized with the emotional and spiritual space I was in. And they also believed God on my behalf. They did not give up trusting that God would see me through this wilderness. I leaned heavily on the faith they lent me. To be honest, I had long given up on a daily quiet time, but I continued rhythms of regular journaling and giving God space to speak. About a year after arriving in New Zealand, I was drawn to Isaiah 43:19. For I am about to do something new. See, I have already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. God was promising to bring me through the wilderness I was experiencing. I sometimes remembered that verse as I tramped, and it brought me hope that God would see me into the land of life again. In the past few years, I've intentionally planned monthly overnight tramps because I know they're soul-filling. Continued connecting with deep-hearted friends. In 2019, I spent several months in a self-directed sabbatical to work through some bigger issues. I moved to a modern monastery which gave me a physical place to heal, but it also invited me to commit to prayer rhythms, to extend hospitality to people on the margins, and to work on the land with others. This journey has been slow, but the desert places of my soul are coming back to life. Maybe you're in a dry or difficult space. As I've prepared for this workshop, I've prayed for the weary souls who I envisioned would be here. And if there's nothing else you take from this workshop, I want to say that there is hope. God has not left you, and God will continue to draw you in. What I've learned is that it's in the midst of dryness that God is there. We need to experience the dark night in order to see the first signs of daylight. We see this in Isaiah 43, the passage that I want to look at today. So Isaiah's overall message is one of judgment, but also one of hope for the Israelites. Assyria and Babylon have destroyed Israel, and Israel is in exile. They've lost their homes, their stability, their livelihoods, everything they had once known. Through Isaiah, God is promising a new city and redemption, but that's not their lived reality yet. We may be familiar with the future hope that's described starting in Isaiah 40, when God is fulfilling God's promises. But Isaiah is speaking prophetically, and the Israelites have yet to experience this hope. That's the tension of walking with God in dry and difficult times. We read and hear the promises God has made, but we don't experience them in our present lives. So let's look at Isaiah 40, 1-5 together. So Isaiah 43, 1-5. It says, "But now, O Jacob, listen to the Lord who created you. O Israel, the one who formed you, says, do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I gave Egypt as a ransom for your freedom. I gave Ethiopia and Seba in your place. Others were given in exchange for you. I traded their lives for yours because you are precious to me. You are honored and I love you. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. When I first came upon this passage years ago, this was long before burning out and coming to New Zealand. Honestly, I found it frustrating as much as comforting. The Brenda version of the Bible at the time would have said, "When you go through deep waters, I will rescue you." But God doesn't say that. To my annoyance, God doesn't pull us out of difficult situations. Instead, God gives 2 commands and several promises. My tendency is to view God as a taskmaster that I must please before I can approach. Doing is my natural way of operating, and that's how I've interacted with God. But what does God command the Israelites? Not to trust more, or to work harder, or to earn God's love. No, God tells them to listen and to not be afraid. I'm learning te reo, and I've appreciated how sometimes I can piece together the meaning of words or phrases from the parts. Whakarongo means to listen, hear, and obey. Breaking it down, rongo means to hear, feel, smell, taste, perceive. It's used for all the senses except sight. Rongo, then, to me, seems to be about experiencing with our bodies, to know with our bodies. Whaka, of course, is an action word, to cause something to happen. This, to me, paints the picture of what God is inviting us into in Isaiah 43, to engage with God through our ears, through our hands, through our noses, our tongues, our perceptions. Interestingly, rongo doesn't include sight. When we're in dry and difficult times, we can't often see our way forward. We can't see God. We can't see anything hopeful. To me, God's invitation to listen is to rest into the physical knowing of God's goodness. God's other command is to not be afraid. The Israelites that Isaiah was addressing had much to fear. They had been displaced and under the rule of a foreign empire. So much of what they had known had been lost. We too can fear in many ways, but I'm reminded of how Jesus addresses the disciples in Mark 6 when they are rowing against a fierce storm and he appears to them. "Don't be afraid," he says. "Take courage, I am here." God's very presence calms our anxieties and fears. When I was in the depths of my burnout and wrestling with God, I was angry and fearful. I was angry with the ways that God wasn't responding to me, and I was afraid that I would never experience God again. At Ngatiawa River Monastery, where I live, we have an extended silence after the Bible reading each evening during prayers. At first, I was restless during the 10-minute silences, not knowing what I should be hearing or thinking or praying. But slowly, as I chose to be open to God, I settled into the quiet and into the communing with God that comes after a storm. God calls us to listen and to not be afraid. What God offers when we listen and trust is deep security. God has ransomed us. God has called us. We are God's. God is with us. We will not be overcome by the dangers that surround us. God has already acted to give us freedom. Do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. God has already redeemed us through Jesus. That is done, and nothing can change it. I have called you by name. You are mine. That's probably my favorite line in this passage. God knows us so intimately and specifically. We belong to God. We are secure knowing whose we are. And while God doesn't take us out of trying times, God promises presence. I will be with you, he says. There's a comfort to knowing that God is with us, even when we can't feel God. That can also be hard, I've found, when I've known intellectually about God, but haven't actually known God. The Hebrew word for to know is yada, and has a broader meaning than simply to understand something. Yada is used in Genesis 4, verse 1, when Adam knew his wife and conceived Cain. So this is an intimate, deep knowing that is also covenantal. Yada is used in Psalm 139 when the psalmist talks about God knowing him and searching his heart. When we know God and when we are known by God, our ways of interacting change. For me, this is why my physical experience of God during that prayer time was so significant. That experiential knowing of God in my body overrode my burnout exhaustion, my disillusionment, and my lack of feeling God in the present. Over the past several years, I haven't engaged with God in the ways I was taught. There were years when I couldn't read my Bible or have a quiet time. Haven't always had the mental or spiritual capacity to memorize scripture or to pray very much. Any discipline I had before burnout had fizzled. But what I did have was what kept me going with God. People, practices, and peak experiences. Over the years, I've cultivated and worked at maintaining deep-hearted friends with whom I would share vulnerably. I sought time with mentors. Of course, these were reciprocal relationships, but when I was in the deepest questioning and driest times, it was these people who I leaned on heavily and who lent me their faith. Spiritual practices also enable us to keep close to God. For many, this is the daily quiet time or musical worship. For me, scripture memory, rhythms of time and creation, and liturgy have been practices that I found nourishing. I used to keep my little verse pack in my pocket, and I would pull it out when I was walking to work or waiting in a queue. These days, I schedule overnight tramps a month or two in advance so that those weekends are protected in my diary. In my community, we've committed to daily rhythms of prayer, and using liturgy helps us to pray without preparation or needing to feel like it. Thirdly, peak experiences, those times when God turns up and moves in meaningful ways. Of course, we can't control when God will work, but we can put ourselves in postures that leave us open to the possibility of God meeting us significantly. This is continually showing up to God, even in small ways. I was regularly seeking God in healing prayer sessions when I had that big prayer experience in Colorado. So sometimes our practices can lead to peak experiences. I want to take time now for each of you to identify ways that you can be open to God in dry and difficult times. So those 3 areas I want you to think about: people, practices, and peak experiences. So who are the people with whom you can connect? What are the practices that nourish your soul? How can you put yourself in positions where you may experience God in a peak experience? So take some time now and consider one person, one practice, and one position. Right now, and have you take action on one of your people, practice, or peak experience. So you have my full permission to pull out your phone and text or email a friend to schedule a time to connect, or diary some time to do your practice. So yeah, do that right now before you forget. Or if you're not ready to take action, you can make a note to yourself to do it later. You've already got it. Great. So people, practices, and peak experiences. So with peak experiences, it's a bit tricky because we don't know when God will move, but to put us into positions or postures where we're open to God. It could be, yeah, definitely. Someone in the previous workshop mentioned how my monthly tramps are both a practice, but then also can lead to peak experiences. And then I remembered there was a very significant experience I had with a kiwi bird on Rakiura, Stewart Island. That was one of the peak experiences for me spiritually. So yeah, so it's kind of a practice can lead to a peak experience sometimes. So what I want to do with the remainder of our time is to practice an exercise called imaginative prayer together. Has anyone heard of that? Oh, good, a few of you. Excellent. For those of you who don't know, imaginative prayer is based on the idea that God can speak to us through our imagination and through our feelings, as well as our intellect and rational mind. As navigators, we tend to be good at knowing the Bible and intellectualizing our faith, and that's important. But I want to invite us into a deeper connection with God, kind of experiencing Jesus in a way that surpasses our rational left brain and the way that we can tend to interact with God and the world. So imaginative prayer takes us into possibility and creativity, and it invites us into an encounter with God, with Jesus, that we feel and experience. So I'll read a passage, and then I'll be pausing throughout. I'll be posing some questions that will help you to imagine more deeply and to enter the scene. This will be slow. There will be some silence, but invite you to just enter in as much as possible, and just trust where your imagination goes with it. Are there any questions before we begin? No? Okay. So you can get comfortable where you're sitting. There are some beanbag chairs at the back if you like. Yeah. I had them at the front in the first session, but then they shifted them to the back. I guess they wanted more chairs. So yeah, just get into a comfortable position. Loosen any tension in your body. Often we're carrying some tightness in our shoulders or neck or jaws. And take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes to help you focus on the story and the images in your mind and to limit distractions. Ask for God's grace to reveal what is needed in this time. The passage we're looking at is from Mark 6, when Jesus walks on water, which follows Jesus feeding the 5,000. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then he climbed into the boat and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed.
Sorry, can you give us the reference, please?
Mark 6:45 to 51. So imagine being by the lake. The disciples are tired after the feeding of the 5,000. They need rest. Place yourself among the disciples. You may be one of them, or you may be you just being with them in the scene. What do you see? What do you touch? What do you taste? What do you smell? What do you feel? What do you hear? How does your body feel? What's going on through your mind? Look at the crowd slowly dispersing. The lake, the boat, the sky. What do you notice? What are the sounds of the crowd, the water, seabirds, the breeze? Jesus is organizing the boat for you to get across the lake. He's sending the crowd away. What is that like as you hear him giving instructions and organizing? You get into the boat. Are you rowing? Or do you have time just to sit and reflect on all that has happened? You look back to the shore. You notice Jesus directing the final stragglers of the crowd. You see him making his way up the hill to pray. What is that like to watch Jesus go? As the boat reaches further out on the lake, the water becomes rough. The waves are larger now as you row into a headwind. The sky is darkening as clouds roll in and the wind picks up. What is that like? Do you feel unwell with the lurching waves? How are your arms and shoulders as you pull against the strength of the waves? What feelings arise in you? As you and the disciples struggle on, you notice a figure coming toward you, seemingly on the water. What is your gut reaction? Your ears pick up a voice calling, rolling to you over the waves. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. The figure climbs into the boat with you. The wind suddenly stops. The water eases its lashing. You recognize Jesus. How does it feel to have Jesus come to you? Imagine Jesus taking a seat next to you, joining you as you row to shore. What does Jesus say to you? Is there something you would like to say to Jesus? Stand this moment, sit with Jesus. We'll take a couple minutes in silence to imagine this conversation. Slowly come back to the present. Take a couple of breaths and open your eyes. I encourage you to take time this weekend to journal or express your response to this time with Jesus. And capture the feelings in addition to the words. Walking with God in dry and difficult times is a journey of bumps and turns. I still don't experience God in my gut. This has been one of the casualties of my burnout, and I've questioned whether I still believe if I can't feel God like I used to. God has renewed me significantly over the past few years, but mostly I hang on to the reality that God was with me before, that God did meet me in that prayer experience, and that I continue to experience God in the people and creation around me. One of the things I heard from God during that prayer time in Colorado was that God is not done with me. Isaiah 43:20-21 reiterates this reality and gives the desert experience purpose. It says, "The wild animals in the fields will thank me, the jackals and owls too, for giving them water in the desert. Yes, I will make rivers in the dry wasteland, so my chosen people can be refreshed. I have made Israel for myself, and they will someday honor me before the whole world." God is present with us, and even the animals in the wilderness. God sustains created beings in the desert so we can be refreshed. But that's not where things end. Our desert experiences are not without purpose. God is making a way through the wilderness, and God will use our dry and difficult times to be honored. When I was in my early years of burnout and couldn't see my way forward, many friends reminded me of this. They had the faith to see beyond my current reality and to trust God on my behalf for the redemption of my experience. Part of that redemption is this workshop that I can stand here today and to share about God making a path in my wilderness. There is hope. Namihikia koto.